Hey guys, and welcome back to another video in our series putting the different Jetpack library pieces together. In this video, actually in the previous video, we started talking about something called clean architecture. And we showed how we can actually take different pieces of logic, what we were calling business logic, essentially logic that's fulfilling the business requirements of whoever our stakeholder is, who's ever funding this app. And we showed how we can take that and extract it into our use case classes that we built last time. And if we look back at our diagram that we were drawing, we said that's not going to go in the presentation layer any longer, and it's not going to be in the data layer. It's actually going to be in this new layer we created called the domain layer. We're putting all of our business logic inside this domain layer now. And we said all that logic is going to be contained within the use cases of the domain layer. But there's one other thing, and it's going to be the domain model that we want to add into this domain layer. And basically what a domain model is that's going to be whatever data model our application is built around. So in this case, that's going to be our book class. That's going to be the data model that's used internally in both our domain layer and then in our presentation layer. But we want this data class to actually be totally agnostic of any third-party libraries. In other words, our book class shouldn't have any dependencies to it. So if we come back to our program and look at it, you can right away see there's a problem here. All of these imports, we're importing third-party libraries, and anything where we have this annotation that's indicating use of that third-party library. And we want this class again to be pure Kotlin code, and it should be totally agnostic of any third-party libraries, because if we ever need to go back and modify anything along this chain, basically modify like where we're getting our data or how we're getting our data or how we're storing our data or anything like that, we don't want to have to change code in our data layer and our domain layer and our presentation layer. We only want to have to change stuff in our data layer. And that's also it's going to make it easier to reuse that later. It's going to make it easier to test later. And then if we ever want to use any of this code in either our domain layer or our presentation layer in future projects, it'll be much easier to reuse that with different data sources and different ways that we're storing and retrieving our data. So to do that, here in our domain layer, we're going to have our domain model, which will simply be our book class. And then over in our data layer, because we have data coming from our Firebase database online through our API, and then we also have different data coming from our room database, which is our local cache. I'm going to actually create two new classes here. And these are going to be called data transfer objects. And one is going to be to store the data coming in from our API, from that Firebase database. And the other is going to store the data coming in from our room database locally. And the reason I'm going to create two separate classes here is because those are actually going to be data that's stored in a slightly different format based on where it's coming from. So let's go ahead and get started on that. Go back to Android Studio. And in Android, in Android Studio, we have our book class. Basically, I'm just going to copy all of this. Copy down from here. And I'm going to make a new file here. A new Kotlin class for file. And this is going to be a data class. And this, I'm going to call this one remote book, and this is going to be for any data coming in from our Firebase through our API. So in here, I'm just going to paste everything we copied and then rename that to remote book. Now, basically, to get this in the format we need, we have to delete out anything that looks like, or anything that is a room dependency. So I'm going to come up here, delete all three of these room import lines. And now, basically, everything that went red, we have to delete out of this file. And this last one, you'll notice I could delete the red, but now there's no serialized name after that either. And that's because we're not reading this finished field in from our Firebase database online. Basically, we're setting that internally within our application. So I'm going to delete that actually entirely out of this remote book class. And this is going to be our data transfer object for that remote book. Let's go ahead and make the local book one as well. So again, right click new Kotlin class or file, and this is also going to be a data book class. And we're just going to call this local book. Hit enter on that. And then in here, same thing. I'm pretty much going to paste all of that code. And this time, instead of removing all the Rome, I want to remove all of the serialized name, all of that JSON deserialization. So now I'm going to delete that. And then first, we're going to change this book to local book, which is the name of my new class. And then I'm going to delete anywhere where that serialized name field pops up. Okay, so now that we have our DTOs ready, that is our class to store the data coming in from the room database, and then our remote book class to store the data coming in from Firebase, we can go back to our book class here, and we can delete all of these dependencies because we no longer need any of them. And this can just be a pure Kotlin class again. There we go. That one looks much simpler now. Let's go on over to our books.db, that is our database file. And basically, in this file, we need to change our book class up here because we're no longer reading in a book from the database. We're reading in a local book, which is the DTO that we built for data coming in from our local class. And when we make this change, our version here, if we don't update this, we could potentially run into a problem. So we have two options here. We could update that to version 2, or we could come to our app, or come to our phone rather, and find our application and go to app info. And then if we uninstall that application, then we actually won't end up having to change that version number, and I can run that again. It'll end up working. But obviously, this is not a if you have an app that's in production and you have thousands of users who've already downloaded this app, it's not a workable solution to have them remove their application before before opening it again or before installing your update. So that's what this is here. And what you would do is you would just up your version, and then you would have to define a migration strategy as well, which would take all of their old data in their old database format and translate that into the new database. But that's not what this video is about, so we're not going to worry about that. I just removed the app, which removes the database from our phone, which means there is no old data. And now I can leave that at version 1, and it's not a problem. So we should be good to go moving forward. Let's go over to our partial book finished class. Where is that? So here it is, our partial book finished. Well, this is actually not a partial book anymore. If you look at this class, what we're storing is just the ID and then our finished field. And we're only using this within our data class. So I'm just going to rename this just right here. I'll right click, refactor, rename, and I'm going to rename this to partial local book finished. Just because that's going to be a little bit more clear about what we're actually doing in this code. And you can see it updates it here as well over in the project window. So that's exactly what we want. Now we need to go to our books DAO as well. And in this books DAO, you can see we're returning a book here, book here, book, pretty much anywhere in here where we see book, we're going to have to replace that with local book. So that's going to return a list of local books. This is also going to take in a list of local books. And then our entity is no longer going to be a book, it's going to be a local book. And then this partial book, that one's fine. It's already updated because we did the refactor to partial local book. In here, this is going to be a local book as well. And then down here, we're going to return a list of local books. In our Git book, we are again returning a local book. And then finally, in the add book, we're adding a local book, which is the book we're using for our room database, essentially. Now we need to go over into our books repository class and go to our toggle finish database function. And basically in here, if you did the refactor, this should be fine. Just make sure this says partial local book finished now instead of just partial book finished. You shouldn't have to worry about that. This should already have changed here, and then also in your refresh cache function, you'll notice that updated as well. But if you just renamed it by typing and didn't do the right-click refactor, you may have to come and change these manually by hand. Now for our local book, we also have to update our get cached books function because this books DAO is now returning a local book, and this is expecting a book to be returned. So we could make that a local book, and now that error is going to go away. But now we've introduced an error somewhere else in our code, so we don't want to do that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to do a .map extension function, and we're going to map this local book to an actual book. So in here, we're just going to do a book class, and our ID is going to equal it.id, it being whatever we're mapping. So in this case, that's our local book. It.id title equals title dot title equals it dot title, and then author equals it dot author, genre equals it dot genre, series equals it dot series, and then finished equals it dot finished. And there we go. Now that error is gone, and now we're taking any local book that's coming in and we're mapping it to a book file, which is going to make our app perform basically exactly the same. And that way we can use our local book within our data layer, and then we can use our book within, we can use our local book within our data layer, and then we can use our book within our domain, our presentation layer. Next, let's go on over to our Books API and do that same thing for the remote book. So in here, you'll see we're still using a book, and of course the API is within our data layer, so we don't want to use the book. We want to use a remote book in here. So I'm going to rename this one to remote book, and then same thing down here where we're returning a book. We want to actually return a remote book there as well. After that's done, come on back to your books repository and we find this refresh cache function. You'll notice we have an error there as well. We need to update that. So now that we've updated our API, this is actually going to be a list of remote books, and we need to again map those remote books for use in our data layer over to book objects for use within the rest of our application. So in here, we're going to do the same thing where it's going to be remote books dot map, and then we're just going to use that mapper function to map those as well. We're going to map that to a local book, and then in here we're going to do id equals it dot id, same type of thing, title equals it dot title, author equals it dot author, and then genre equals it dot genre. And finally, we're going to do series equals it dot series. And again, just to clarify what's going on here, this dot map function is taking a remote book from our list of remote books and then mapping that to a local book object where the ID, title, author, genre, and series for our local book are the same as the ID, title, author, genre, and series for the remote book that it came from. Now that that's done, you'll notice we have an error up here on the book details repository as well. So let's go ahead and open that. And within this refresh cache function, you can see we have a remote book, and again, a type mismatch where we have a local book required, but a remote book is found. So what we can do there is we can map it again, but you'll note before we had a list of books, now we just have an individual book. So for just an individual book, we're just going to use .let, which is another extension function that we can use to map this remote book into a local book. So to do that, basically all we're going to do is, and I'm just going to actually copy the same fields from there and paste them into our local book. And we're just mapping all of our remote book fields to our local book. So that's good and refresh cache. But we have a similar problem down here in our get single book function. Yeah, so basically, we've got this return with context function and it returns our get books, but this again is going to have a type mismatch where we have a book required and we're finding a local book. So to do that, we're going to do a .let to map this function over, and I'm going to map that to a book. And then inside of that book, we can paste those same fields where we have ID, title, author, genre, series, and the only one we're going to add here is going to be finished equals it dot finished. And then same thing down here where we're doing that, we're just going to use .let and map that to a book again using our .let extension function. And now we should be good to go there as well. And I should also mention here that the reason why we're using .let before, just to make this clear, before we use .map, that's because before we're working with a list of books here, or a list of remote books. So we're going to use .map to map fields of individual objects within a list to each other. And then we're going to use .let to map individual objects. So here, this isn't returning a list of books, this is just returning one single book. So now if I was to go ahead and compile and run my program on my phone, it's actually going to behave exactly like it did before. The only difference now is that we have successfully separated out our domain model from our data models. But as far as the functionality of the app, it should be totally the same. But this is kind of clunky because now you see in our repository, well, we map it here, we map it here, we map it here, and then we go back over to our books repository, we map it here, we map it here, and all of this code looks pretty similar. And that's something that we don't want to have in our program is just repeated code over and over and over again, especially in files that are already pretty long, and this is just adding more lines of code to that file. So what I like to do actually is we're going to create in Book Tracker. So go over to your project window, new, and we're just going to do a new Kotlin class or file. And this one is actually not even going to be a class, it's just going to be a file. And we're going to name this Book Mapper. Whoops, not Book Mapper. We're going to name this Book Mapper. And basically in here, I'm just going to create a bunch of extension functions to map my local book to my remote book to my book. And that way we can have all the extension functions in one place in our code, and then we can just use those wherever we need to. So in here, we're going to find book dot, we need a book to a remote book. And that is, of course, going to return a remote book. And inside of that function, we're just going to return remote book where my ID equals ID, where my title equals title, where my author equals author, my genre equals a genre, and where my series equals my series. So that takes care of that, but we also need to add pretty much mapping functions for everything. So now I'm going to say, I'll just actually copy this and change it instead of retyping that 100 times. But we're going to say book to, instead of remote book, we're going to say to local book. And then instead of returning a remote book, we're also going to return a local book. And down here, we're also going to return local book. And then within this, it should be good. Again, the only thing we're going to add is our finished field because we're using that in the local book and the book, but not in our remote book. So we're just going to set that equal to finished. And now we have book going to both others. So I'm going to copy that, paste it below. And now this is going to be, instead of book to local book, I'm going to do local book to book. And we're going to return a book there. And same thing down here, return a book. So now we have that local book to a book. Let's also add one for a local book to a remote book. And then again, returning a remote book. So down here, we need to update our return statement to be a remote book as well. And then the only thing we can dump is this finished field. And there we go. We have local book to a book and local book to a finished book. So now I copy that same thing and we're going to do a remote book to a local book and then a remote book to a book. So there's our local book there. And then we'll do a remote book to a book as well. So remote book to book, and instead of returning a local book there, return a book. And now we have all these mapper functions that we can use within our repositories. So let's go on over to our book details repository. And in here, we no longer need this .let function. So I'm going to get rid of that. And instead of returning just a remote book, again, you'll see we have here a type mismatch where we have a local book required and we found a remote book. So all we're going to do is say .to local book, and that should fix that. And now this is just much simpler, easier code. And then same thing down below where we have this .let turning a book. We can go ahead and delete all of that again. And you'll notice an error pops up again, and it's a type mismatch, required book, found local book. So all that we're going to do there is going to say .to book, and then same thing down here, delete this let function and do a .to book. So by having now we have our data transfer objects, which holds our data for our essentially our data that comes in from our HTTP request from retrofit. It stores that in our remote book. And then we have these mappers to map them to local books. And now this code is much simpler. We just deleted, what is that, like 15 lines of code out of this file, and it's a lot shorter, easier to read. And if I ever need to know what this function is doing, I have that all saved here in my book mappers. But now come back over to our books repository, and we have one more issue here that we need to address. So if we delete this .map and then say .to, well, you'll notice we don't have a .to function established here because, again, we're not just doing a local book to a remote book. What we're doing is actually a list of local books to a list of remote books. And then same thing up here. So basically, we need to add that function. We need to add this function into our mappers file. So go back into your mappers file, and I'm just going to add a few more. You could do these every which way, just like we did for these conversions, but you'll notice there's some of them we're not even using. So that's fine. So anything here that's dark gray, that means we're not using, and yellow means we're using it somewhere in our code. So what we're going to do is just add a couple of functions for mapping lists together. And I'm only going to define these functions for lists that we actually need to map together right now. So fun, list, and in here, this is going to be remote book. And basically, we need to be able to map a remote book, a list of remote books, to a local book list. And that is, of course, just going to return a list of local books. And to do that, all we need to do is return this .map And then we need that local book, and I'm just actually going to copy it from over here. Let's copy this field and back into here and make that a local book, and then get rid of this finish field. We don't need that anymore. And then we're going to do the same thing again. So we have this list of remote books to a list of local books. And now I'm just going to do a list of local books to a list of books. So this is going to be to book. And the only thing that we need to modify, we need to make that a book class, and then we need to add finished back in. So finished equals it.finished. And now, if we come back on over to our books repository, basically this .map we can now delete. And again, you see, well, we're expecting to have a list of books, but we found a list of local books. So what we can do here is say dot to book list, and that fixes that error. And then down here again, you can see we're expecting a list of local books, but we found a list of remote books. So all we need to do there is do dot to local book list, and now we're good to go. So now this code is much cleaner. Both of these repository files have fewer lines of code in it, and we're not repeating that over and over and over again. If you look in the book mapper file, obviously we actually are repeating this over and over and over and literally over again. But that's okay. This is why we put this in the mapper file. We expect to see stuff like that in the mapper file. However, we don't like to see repeated code like that within like this here within the repository itself. So this is actually a much better design now, and our code looks cleaner. It's easier to read when we look at this, and it's shorter. So that's pretty much all we have for this video. You can look back at the diagram again and see we added that domain model there, and then we added some DTOs into our data layer, and then we added mappers to translate back and forth between those two. So now in the next video, this will be the third and final video in this series, at least on clean architecture. And we're going to start looking over at this project window here, because you can see the more files we keep adding, the longer this ends up getting. And one of the benefits of separating everything into these different layers that we have in our diagram here is now if we look in here, every file within here should have a nice neat layer category that it fits into. So we're going to use that to go ahead and organize this data in the next video. So hopefully you found this video helpful. Like and subscribe to our channel if you did, and we'll see you in that next video where we start to introduce some of that organization.